Okay, welcome to the third dev blog on Global Gambit. Today we are going to be looking at region ownership, so we can see which country owns what region. So our goals for today, we're going to finish the highlights for all regions, because currently only certain regions actually go white when you click it. We're going to show ownerships for regions so the player knows who owns it. We're going to create some simple nations for testing to prove that that works. Okay, so the way I've done regions is that every region has a PNG, and so basically to do the highlights properly I have to go through each one. This is what the extracted image looks like from the main map. So I've gone through, added a blended, added a stroke, set the border to about 1 pixel. Then when I zoom in, I noticed that the way I've extracted it has made it a little bit messy. So I've had to use the Photoshop tools to remove the bits I do not want to show up for both the highlight and for the ownership mask. So just going through, just removing all the pixels I don't want. Try and do it the quickest way possible, which was just basically just scrolling and selecting areas and just pressing delete. However, for certain areas I've had to use the eraser tool, change the amount of pixels I need to rub out by a little bit, and then just zoom in a little bit more just to try and make it as detailed as possible. So just having a look around, yeah, there's a couple extra pixels over there, a couple extra pixels over here. Okay, once I'm happy, I then go to the paint bucket tool and just paint it all white. And then when I go to save as, change the file type to PNG and overwrite the original extraction of the image. Had to do that for over 200 images, so it was a bit of a time-consuming job. Anyway, finish highlight for all regions. That is now done, so nice tick. So now we're going to show the ownership for regions, the real part of this blog. Okay, so this is my first attempt. I'm going to be using shaders. Now, you don't need to follow this bit. If you want to skip to attempt 2, that's fine, because this ends up being a giant fail. So Godot has its own shader function, and you can link it, so that's what I've done here. And at that point, you then code your own shaders to say what color is going to show on top of your texture files. After playing around with it for a little bit, it did mess up my highlighting. So when you click on a region now, it no longer highlights stuff, and it did produce some interesting colors. So I'll just show you some examples of the chaos I've had over the last few days. This was my first attempt. So it's doing something. It's added color on top, but once again, the highlighters don't work at this point, and it's not really the colors I was after. So I then played around with the shader code and ended up with this really cool looking one. Once again, not quite what I was after. And then finally I gave up when it came up to this purple and blue one. So went back to the drawing board, went back to how I did the highlights. So in my second attempt, basically used very similar code, but to start with, I need to declare all my nations and what color I want them to be. And then I use this function called show all ownership, which basically takes the highlights I've used previously, scales it and makes sure it matches the position of where the nations are. And then basically I then get the sprite overlay to change its color. So it takes that region and just changes the color a little bit. So the region matches the JSON file, because otherwise it won't know which PNG to load up. So when you click on something, it then goes to that region and takes the region name from the PNG file. And then for it to do its job, we have a function called show all ownership. And that's where we set the texture, position, centering, scale, rotation stuff. Right, if you run it, you can now see that we're going to have several countries. We've got the United Kingdom all in red, we've got France all in blue, and I've done bits of Italy, so you can see that in green. But if you click each region, you can still see, you can still click it. But the problem is at this stage is that we're doing the ownership in regions all kind of in the same thing. So I want to split it up a little bit. So this should help us in the future when countries start taking regions. So making two different 2D nodes, one for ownership layer and one for highlight layer. And it's not a massive change in our code. So we're just going to go back in the mains. We've got two variables that set up those nodes, and then we've scrolled down, and basically in front of the add childs, we're just saying what variables are linking to what nodes. So ownership layer is added to the ownership function, and the highlight layer node is then added to the highlight layer. So we've got highlight layer.addChild. So that now splits it up, so it shouldn't cause issues in the future. And you can still see that all the previous code's working as intended, and you can even see I've started to add Russia. Now the problem is we're having all these armies at the top, or sorry, nations, is that it's going to make our Main.gd really complicated and really long. So ideally we want to simplify that and have all our nations in a different file. So we're going to start off by creating a folder called scripts, because I have a feeling that we're going to need quite a few scripts in the future for all this to work. And inside of scripts, we are going to basically make a new script file, and we're going to call it NationManager. And in our NationManager, we're going to set up some variables that will store the name of it as a string. We're going to store the color, and we're going to basically all the regions that nation owns are in the array. So here's an example of France. And then at the bottom, we've got three functions. We'll talk more about those later. And now, instead of having all of that nation code at the start, we've now just got to go into that file. So that makes our main a lot more easy to read. And so here's our nation manager, and you can see that I've already started adding other nations as well. And that's kind of the structure I would like it. And once again, that matches the JSON file. Okay, so in terms of the last three functions in our nation manager, so first of all, we've got function map regions to nations. And what it does is it goes for every nation in the nations dictionary, and for each nation it looks at all the region names listed. Then it builds a lookup table. Then our second function is our change region owner, and we'll need this in the future, but basically removes the old owner of the region if it exists, and removes that region from the old owner's list of regions. So we don't need it at this moment, but it will be useful for the future. Right, and then our last function is get region owners. So what it does is it returns the nation object that owns that specific region. If no one owns it, it returns null. Okay, so back in our main, we now have a variable called Nation Manager, which links to our Nation Manager script, which now links everything together. Notice the nations are no longer listed at the top, which makes our code a lot more simpler. And in our function ready, we're using our variable and connecting to the create nations function, which is in the Nation Manager, which means now our main code is not quite as long as it was, but it is still picking up a bit of code in it. But we have reduced its size by not having every nation that we're going to have playing this game listed. So as you can see, as I'm scrolling down the main, all of the previous functions that we set up in previous blogs is all still there. I've even added one called capture regions, which we'll need in the future, so I won't talk about it just yet. But the highlights are still there, the camera controls are still there. Basically our main looks nice and well set. And if we run it, you can see that the nations of United Kingdom and France and Germany are all set up, including Spain, and you click it, and it does the nice highlighting thing. So everything is working as intended. And we can still scroll around, we can still zoom in. All of the nations now have a highlight, so there's not a single one that doesn't go white when you click it, which is great. So we've finished the highlights of all regions. We've shown ownership of regions for the players who owns it. We've created some simple nations for testing, and we've simplified the code. And we've even made it run separately to the highlight section. So that was a lot. Right, okay, so we're getting towards the end of the blog now. As usual, I will put the code in the description. Any questions, feel free to ask in the comments, and I will see you next time.